Hello and welcome back to CamBro Conversations. Today's conversation, I'm delighted to be joined by Katie Gatti, better known as Money with Katie. Katie, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Colin. So excited to be here.
Yes, and we're definitely ready to rumble. And when I was looking at getting you on the podcast, Katie, I know that you have been blogging about finances and working as a personal finance consultant since 2018. But I'd love us to wind back the clock a little bit and go towards who was Katie Gatti before she discovered things like financial independence. Like what led to the path that we're now on?
Well, she was probably a little bit less annoying to the people around her, if I had to guess. But yeah, I think it's funny because, the way I think about it, everybody has to have that financial awakening at some point. It's almost, unless you have an unlimited amount of funds from some random source, like it's a non-negotiable part of life where you have to kind of have that financial reckoning. And for me, I think it came down to a period of time where I was working full time and side hustling a little bit just because I wanted to. I was teaching fitness classes on the side, and I kind of realized, I don't really feel like I have a whole lot to show for all the work that I'm doing and how busy I feel all the time. Like, shouldn't I have more? And I would hear my guy friends talking about investing and hear little side conversations around stocks or how much money they were making, and it just kind of interested me. I was like, well, I want a piece of that. And so it got me into this idea of like building wealth. And I say that as opposed to making money because I think they're very different things. You can be a high earner and make a lot of money, but if you're not keeping most of that money, it really doesn't matter. So I think there are systems that I had to put in place and things that I began to discover on that journey. And as I realized, like, oh my God, there's so much information about this on the internet that I can learn anything I want to about building wealth and investing and the best practices. But yeah, you have to put those systems in place. And so I think that was kind of the journey that I found myself on, was really driven by the fact that I felt like I was a little bit treading water, or just like on a treadmill, like staying in one place despite putting forth a lot of effort. So that was really like the turning point for me and what got me interested.
If you had guy friends that were more passionate about finance, and it does seem to be the way of things, although you're definitely turning the tide with
I hope
rich
so.
girls, you've got lots of rich guys that listen to your podcast as well and tune into your blog as I do. And I just guess with these guys talking about that kind of thing, what sources do you maybe gravitate towards? Because hearing your friends talk about it typically isn't enough for us to be reassured that we need to go down the rabbit hole in something as big and as deep as financial independence.
Totally. So I think just getting the exposure to things like individual stock investing through them and seeing their huge gains and huge losses, that didn't so much appeal to me because it seemed like a job in and of itself. Like sitting around and trading all day, I was like, oh, I don't know, I don't want to do that. Like that sounds like a lot of work. But I started to Google things like personal finance best practices or investing tips. And I would find myself gravitating toward the FIRE bloggers because I felt like, okay, man, if these people are already retired in their 30s, clearly they're on to something. Like, even if this is the most extreme path, I kind of got the sense that there would be really good learnings to glean from the way that they approached finance. So people like the Choose FI podcast, that was a big one for me early on. Mr. Money Mustache, he's very frugal. That's his thing. The Mad Fientist, who has come on the show, the Money with Katie show, which was a really cool full circle moment. But he's really into investing in tax strategies and these very complex ways to never pay taxes again. And so it became very easy for me to get into it once I started to read some of these people's stuff. And I think I just inherently trusted that community because I felt like they were really, really committed. And it wasn't like the finance bro, like machismo thing. It was much more like, hey, there's a better way to approach life. It's not that complicated. It really does come down to earn more, spend less, invest the difference, and you can like buy back your own time and freedom. So those were a lot of the early influences for me. And then over time, I've just become more interested in like finance in general, so macroeconomics, and some of these people that are maybe active investors and like disagree with the passive investing movement. I think there are so many interesting voices in the space, and so I try to be really open-minded and not just like shut things out or shut things down because it doesn't necessarily jive with some of the stuff I was like reading and ingesting early on.
We all have our biases and our echo chambers and the places that we can shut ourselves towards. And that's definitely the case within the financial independence movement as well. You've got people who have their way or the highway. And it's nice to take bits and pieces that you learn from everyone else and you become a bit more of a generalist rather than an extremist.
So it's a good way to put it.
I wonder, when you're saying that you felt like you were treading water, what did that look like? Because I think a lot of people that maybe listen to somebody who's a lot further down the road than you, has the calculations done, is very clear on what the end goal is and maybe how you're going to get to that. It can sometimes be hard for them to bridge the gap between, okay, Katie got into FI and really got hold of her finances from kind of 2018 onwards. She's now considered a bit of an expert in that space. Of course, you've said before, you're always learning, and I respect that tremendously.
Thanks.
But what does it look like when you felt like you're treading water? Because you weren't in a bad position, but you weren't maybe where you are now.
Right. Yeah. So I don't want to give the impression that I was living like paycheck to paycheck. That certainly was not the case. It was more so that the amount of money I was making at the time, it was pretty average. It was like $50,000 a year. So nothing crazy. So it wasn't like, it wasn't like minimum wage, but it certainly was not a 6-figure salary. But the weird thing about that time period and why I always use the phrase treading water is because I was not living large. Like I had an apartment that I paid $800 a month for. I didn't even have a car payment at the time. Like I didn't have crazy high fixed expenses, and I wasn't living overall a lifestyle that I would classify as like above my means. But the problem was that there was no plan in place. So I would effectively like look at my checking account and be like, okay, I can go out to dinner tonight. Or like, okay, I'm going to go shopping this weekend. Or, oh, just kidding. No, I can't. So there was it was very reactive to like whatever that number was. And I would find that like, I could always pay the credit card bill at the end of the month. I could always make rent. It wasn't like I was ever like, oh my God, I can't pay this bill. That was not the case. But it would just kind of be like, oh, okay, cool. Well, there's a couple $100 left over, or like, I pretty much spent everything that came in this month. And there was nothing proactive or strategic about the approach. It was very much just like taking it day by day, and whatever was left over at the end of the month, it was like, all right, cool. I guess I'll move that into savings and like keep going. Or like, oh, I have nothing to move into savings. Maybe I need to take some money out of savings. So definitely did not have that sensation of like forward progress happening. It was just like the money that is coming in is for the most part going out. I don't really actually know where any of it's going. And like that went on for, I don't know, probably 6 to 12 months, maybe longer, if I'm being honest. Probably closer to like 12 to 18 months, really, realistically. And it just doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good when, even if you can pay your bills and you can afford to go out to eat on the weekends, like it doesn't feel good to spend all week working and give another person or your employer like the best time in your day during the best years of your life to be like, I got a couple $100 left over to show for it. It just didn't feel good.
Yeah, because it doesn't enable freedom for you in the longer term, which I think is one of the big values of the FI movement, when people are wanting independence in the future to do what they want to do, spend their time how they want to do it, and have the comforts that they maybe want without being chained to a particular job or industry or amount of time that they have to trade for their money.
Totally.
Yeah, it interests me when you were talking there about saving, and that gets us into one of the big topics which I'd love to discuss with you, and that's that kind of quandary between saving and investing. And the main example that comes to mind for me is when you're thinking about maybe saving a deposit for a property, or are you saving up for a holiday or a wedding or something like that? And people think about, should I lock my money away in like a saving account? Should I lock my money away in an investment account? What kind of approach should I take? What are some of the principles that you would employ, Katie?
Yeah, I think my approach there usually comes down to opportunity cost and timelines. So I have a bit of a unique perspective, I think, about things like property ownership and things like just those like larger expenses where it does require putting a lot of money away on the side. And I think the way I feel that way, or the reason I feel that way, is because sometimes I think we tend to put the cart before the horse. Like, what I mean by that is we get so focused on those types of goals and like, oh, I need to go sock away all this money to buy a house. It's like, well, if we don't really have anything else set aside and like we have nothing saved for retirement and like, you know, all of our extra income right now is going to buy a house and that's going to drain our savings. Like that to me is not painting a picture of like a very financially stable situation. And so I usually like to tell people, and what the approach that I've taken myself is, you want to kind of build that moat around you before you start making those like giant, serious decisions that are going to lock you into something for a long period of time. So, for example, like if I have nothing saved and my goal is to buy a house, it's like, okay, I should probably focus on like getting a little bit of money in cash savings or in an investment account for retirement first before I start focusing on a really big goal like that. And I know it's very common, the house, the wedding, things like that. When you're young, there are tons of big expenses in your 20s, and it can be very tempting to like focus on those without really thinking about the future. But your 20s are a time where the money that you invest for later is going to go the farthest because it's the money in your life that's going to have the longest timeline. So theoretically, the money that you're investing in your 20s is going to have the highest ROI for you of any money that you earn in your whole life. So I think I do think a lot about opportunity cost when I'm like weighing those decisions. The other thing is, I would say, you know, it comes down to timelines as far as like flexibility. And if you're someone that's like, I want to buy a house eventually, I don't know if I want to, I don't know if, you know, I don't know if I want to buy it in the next 2 years, but like eventually I would like to. In that case,
not set on location either, Katie. That's a big one.
Exactly. Like if you're flexible, then I think it's like, okay, then I'm going to invest across my various accounts. I'm going to open a brokerage account and start building up the down payment in there, because then you're going to get the upside of the market. But to the earlier point about flexibility, it's very important that you're flexible because you never know. Like right now we're at a big, we're like what, 18% down year to date. So you know, you're kind of, there is risk involved there. And so if you're like, oh, I need to buy a house at the end of 2023, it's non-negotiable, I have to have this amount of money ready, well, then it's probably not very wise to invest that money. The challenge comes in though, and where I think it becomes less of like a black and white issue, is when you're in a period of time like what we saw between 2020 and the end of 2021. If you thought at the end of 2019, for example, I'm going to buy a house in 2021, so I'm going to start saving in a savings account. This is the house. This is how much it costs, whatever. Well, you saving in that savings account, you missed out on a historic bull run. And guess what? The price of that property is probably 40% higher now. So risk reward. It's like, am I willing to risk that I'm going to have less later in order to like hope that I'm going to have more later? I think that's kind of the calculus you have to run. So, but yeah, I would say in general, like what scares me the most, like the most terrifying thing I see is young people who have nothing saved aside from a down payment, deploying all of their savings to the down payment and then becoming homeowners with like $3,000 in the bank. Like that terrifies me because it's just such an expensive liability to have on your books, and if something goes wrong, that's on you. So I just tell people, like, don't rush. Like if you want to buy a house, now is probably a good time to wait. Like we're seeing, especially in the US, we're seeing demand softening, interest rates are rising. Like obviously you don't want a high interest rate as an owner, but the situation we've been in has been very precarious, and I would never tell someone like, oh my God, go spend everything you have on that house just to get in. Like that to me is a very dangerous mindset.
Yeah, I love both of those particularly in terms of timelines, because like you say, if you have a high risk tolerance as well, you might be happy to not gamble, but to invest your deposit and accept that it might push back your timelines if the market doesn't respond, if we're in a period like just now. But like you said, if you'd been in at the end of 2019, albeit for a little shake in March 2020, you would have been in for a wonderful run, and you would have ended up with more capital to make this huge purchase. And yeah, I think it's definitely a values thing as well, in terms of how important you rank home ownership or these huge expenses, in terms of if you want to do it by X particular age. So I want to be a homeowner by 30, or I want to live in this city by the age of 35 or whatever. I want a family home by this particular milestone. It's there's so many different calculations, and I love conversations around values and expectations and goals, and that should be reflected in our financial behavior as well, as you've said, when it comes to being willing to maybe sit on something and appreciate that it's not going to go up like it would if it was in a stocks and shares account, potentially.
Totally.
You're willing to sit there and be like, right, okay, this is my saving money and it's going to get spent on this, and I just wait it out, regardless of whether it's maybe depreciating because of inflation during this period as well.
Exactly. Well, and I guess it depends on intentions too. And that goes for all of these things. Like, even if we're talking about a $50,000 wedding, like that's not uncommon in the US. So part of me tends to think, like, if you want something that's very expensive solely because it's just what you want, it's going to bring you joy. To me, that changes the calculus a little bit, as opposed to like thinking that something that's very expensive, like a home, is going to be like your main wealth builder or main investment. I think that's the dangerous territory. But every decision comes with trade-offs. Like we said, unless you have an unlimited pot of money to draw from, you're going to have to prioritize. And so I think where people will end up feeling trapped is when they, buy something like a super expensive home with high monthly payments, and then realize once they're in the home, oh shit, all of my capital is now tied up in this house. And in order to continue to pay it off, I have to keep working at this job I don't like. So there is like a degree of flexibility even in your personal life, I think, that comes into play, and how much you how quickly, I guess, you want to be free. And the irony, I think, is that, so Mad Fientist lives in Scotland. He's a renter, and he tried to buy and decided, you know what, never mind. I actually don't think the opportunity cost is worthwhile there. He's 40 years old, has been retired since he's 34, and he still rents. So like, if flexibility is your number one priority and you want that freedom of choice to like work or not work or change jobs or make less, like locking yourself into a 30-year contract for a multi-$100,000 piece of real estate is probably not like the best way to achieve that goal. So I think you're spot on when you say like it really comes down to your values and like the lifestyle that you want for yourself. And for some people, that is staying in the same house for 20 years and like working the same job for 20 years. And for other people, it's the complete opposite of that.
Exactly that. And it's so easy to get railroaded down the path of how maybe your parents did it, or how those around you in society do it as well.
Yep.
I'd be really interested to understand how you've tried to find balance within your long-term financial plan, because I think when we look at some people within the fire space, and I know you've spoken about this in terms of the mindset, you think some of them maybe aren't actually as happy as they maybe portray they are in terms of seeking financial independence, but you seem like somebody that's content in your plan and you're willing to get there in a way that you're happy with in terms of doing the things that you love along the way. What are some of the areas that we need to balance when we're thinking about like a long-term financial plan?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I think the most important things to balance are, it kind of comes down to sustainability. Like to me, there's a difference between the short-term extreme sacrifices you're willing to make, like maybe working a job that pays you really well, but is very stressful for a little bit. That actually might be worth it. If you're going to get a bunch of money that you can sock away and invest for later, that you can live on later, then like maybe you are willing to put up with a terrible job for 12 to 18 months. But I think when it comes to like long-term sustainability, particularly on the spending side, if you are spending so little and scrimping and saving so that your FI number, your annual expenses times 25 or 30 is lower overall so that you can get there faster, that's where I would probably raise the alarm bell and be like, oh, hold on though. Do you want to live this way for the rest of your life? Like, it's okay to live that way for a little bit to make progress. And I think it's sometimes necessary. I definitely went through phases where I was like working crazy hours to make a lot of money and hardly spending any of it because I wanted to like compress that timeline of working and saving into a much shorter duration. So I was willing to put up with that pain, but I knew that it was not long-term sustainable. And I think now I've probably shifted more in the like, okay, I'm starting to ease into like, this is a lifestyle and like spending pattern that I could sustain long term. Like I'm happy with where I live. I'm happy with, you know, the food we're eating. I'm happy with the amount of vacations we're taking. Like that to me is the number that you want to be shooting for, is like, what is the best life that you can live? How much does it cost to live that life? That's the number that you want to go for. So I think it does come down to recognizing, like, is this a short-term unsustainable squeeze that I'm putting myself in to make accelerated progress? Or am I kind of unbeknownst to me, like painting myself into a corner with respect to like, oh, I'm going to have to live this way forever. And I think that's the danger.
Yeah, limiting yourself to this super frugal existence for a massive time span rather than this maybe short-term sacrifice, which you're comfortable with because the goal outweighs the pain of the short term.
Totally. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's interesting. I also think when it comes to things like relationships as well, it's really important you're on the same page as the people around you, whether that's family, friends, or even like a loved one as well. Because when you've got this financial plan, everyone needs to be on board and pulling in the right direction. And you, while we should all do things for our own happiness, if we make decisions that are really quite radical when it comes to our finances, it can actually negatively impact those around us in terms of the amount of time we're willing to spend with them at particular occasions, because it doesn't fit the plan if I come to this particular event.
Absolutely.
It's really difficult. There's so many considerations. The work one's a huge one that you mentioned in terms of, does this align with my values to work in this job, which I maybe don't enjoy? I told you when we were getting this organized, Katie, that I had Steve Adcock on the podcast, and he worked in IT, and he made, I don't know, $130,000 a year, and he hated it. But he was he's like, I can keep going, or I can go work as a trucker for like 50, but I'll enjoy it a little bit more, but it'll push back my retirement date by X number of years. So there are calculations you can make in terms of the amount of pain that you're willing to suffer from a kind of job perspective. But I really wonder what people think when it comes to like time, relationships, and even just general, like how they spend their day-to-day between now and their kind of desired FI date.
Yeah, and it's funny because there's even like I don't want to like draw a correlation where there isn't one, but there's been no shortage of FI and FIRE bloggers and personalities that have come out and said after they reached FI and they retired and they, you know, kind of just like lived the retired life in their 30s or 40s with their spouse, that they end up getting a divorce, which is kind of the like opposite side of the spectrum, where like it wasn't the sacrifice and the work and the pain that like led to divorce. It was the fact that like now they have nothing but time on their hands. And so you're focusing all of your attention on this other person and like spending all your time with this other person. So I think it just goes to highlight the like second and third order consequences of things that we sometimes don't think about. And I think not the divorce part, but just in general, realizing that like, okay, actually in my 30s, I don't know that I would want to have nothing to do. Like, I think originally that was my plan. I was like, I would love to retire at 35 and literally have no job and just like ball out and do whatever. But as I've gotten older and like as I've like gotten more used to that plan, and even the idea, like when I go on a vacation for 6 days, I'm like itching to do something by the end of it. I'm like, oh, I just got to be productive. I got to do something, because it's like there's only so much like laying around and doing nothing that you can do. So I think that has also given me a little bit of balance and permission, I guess, to slow down a little bit and be like, dude, you're investing plenty. Like, it's fine. Who cares if this pushes back the timeline by 2 years? Like, you know, you really don't want to like rush to the finish line if you have no idea what you're going to do when you get there. It's kind of like the dog chasing the car. Like, you catch the car and the dog's like, now what? So I think that's the feeling that I want to avoid. And I think it's very well documented in early retirees. So to the extent that gives somebody, permission to take a more balanced approach or a more sustained approach, I think it's worthwhile. And I think ultimately, like the goal is to have enough money that maybe it's not that you never have to work ever again, but that you have a lot more flexibility in choosing the type of work that you do.
Yeah, exactly that. And you can maintain some sort of purpose. So you would maintain a purpose by having Money with Katie there alongside everything you do. And it depends on how much energy you would want to put into Money with Katie. At that point, it would vary, but it maybe doesn't always feel like work sometimes when you're doing
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why you work so hard, Katie, because sometimes it feels like you're on autopilot, doesn't it? And it's not as sore.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely accurate. I think they're like, I just published a podcast episode this week about this, like the dream job myth. And at the end of the day, it still does feel like a job sometimes. Like anything that has obligations and like tasks that need to be completed is gonna feel like work from time to time. But to your point, I think because I generally really enjoy the content production piece and the feeling of like, oh, I'm helping other people figure this out for themselves and like what it looks like in their own life, it is certainly more fulfilling than the other full-time jobs that I had prior. So in some ways, weirdly, like the fact that I started Money with Katie to be like, let's all talk about what we're going to do when we retire. I'm going to run Money with Katie when I retire and it's going to be fun. And then it like became my full-time job. It's like, it's a little bit like ironic how it all played out. But in a way it's kind of perfect because I'm like, okay, well, this is in some ways like a sneak peek. I'm probably working harder on it now that we're still in like that growth phase and there are revenue goals. And like, it's certainly like, it's not just like a fun little hobby on the side. Like we're accountable now to like people that are expecting it to generate a certain amount of revenue. So there's a little bit more pressure there, but by and large, I think, liking what you do in some capacity is very important from the perspective of like actually being good at it and being able to do it for long enough to get good enough at it to actually make some good money doing it. So I think there are like financial implications to liking what you do.
Yeah, there needs to be a positive feedback loop.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the key areas that is relevant, probably not just when you're chasing an early retirement date, but just general financial freedom or improvements in your financial kind of status, is overcoming the concept of lifestyle creep. And I'd love you to explain a little bit around what that means.
Yeah, so lifestyle creep it happens to everybody. It's basically the phenomenon that happens when you start to earn more money and then you start to spend more money because, oh, look, there's more money around and available to me. And so unless you are very, very aware of it and have a very airtight plan in place, it's almost impossible not to fall victim to it, at least a little bit. And I would say even if you have a plan in place, it's challenging not to fall victim to it a little bit because at a certain point, it starts to feel silly. For example, if you are 23 and you're making $40,000 a year, and so for all intents and purposes, you are living a little bit like a college student if you want to be able to save a significant portion of that income. So maybe you're eating ramen and maybe you're living with 3 other roommates. And so if you try to maintain that lifestyle once you're making 80,000, 120,000, 140,000, like as your income goes up, it's going to feel increasingly absurd to not let your lifestyle improve a little bit, partially just because it's like, why am I working so hard if I like it? My life isn't changing at all, despite the fact that I'm like working hard and succeeding and achieving. So I think it's a matter to me of just keeping it in check and being relentlessly self-aware of it and being aware of the thought patterns that are like kind of pushing you in one direction or the other. So one thing that has been challenging now that we are making substantial incomes, which is a relatively new thing for our family beyond like, I don't know, 2020, like we didn't really start earning a lot until 2021. One thing that I've tried to be very careful about is not up-leveling our lifestyle in areas that are very hard to undo. So we still rent a house that I think is within our, well within our means, as opposed to like pushing the upper limit. Like, oh, okay, well, we make more money now, so let's buy a bigger house or let's buy a nicer car. Like we're trying to not, go crazy on those fixed expenses that are harder to backpedal if something happens, like you lose some of your income. And I'm trying to just kind of give myself the like, the little treats along the way, and the things that truly, like, if we were to get into a recessionary situation where like one of us loses our job, that we could strip that stuff back and turn it all off and be like, okay, back to austerity budget, like overnight. And so I think sometimes we really harp on the little things like going out to eat or shopping or traveling as like, oh, you got to cut back on those. But in reality, those are some of the safest areas to scale up as you earn more, as long as you're keeping some of those larger expenses still pretty reasonable for the amount of money you're making, to where, for example, like in a couple, my goal is to get us to the point where our lower salary of the two, where we could live fully on just one salary, but the lower salary. Right now we're well within the means of the higher one, but like if we lost the higher one, the lower one would not be enough to maintain our current standard of living. So I think that sometimes, especially with couples, like if you can do that, you're probably going to be okay.
I'm so glad you mentioned those larger fixed expenses, because those are the two that spring to mind immediately when I hear somebody like yourself talk about lifestyle creep, because you get a salary increase, so you get the nicer car. You hit your bonus this year, so you're like, oh, well, actually, I'll probably have more money next year to live in a nicer apartment or a nicer flat.
Exactly.
Or I'll be able to join the better golf club or something like that, where they're quite large expenses that can quickly add up. And with the car and the house, you're tied into those because there's a sunk cost there in terms of it's fixed. You're either in some sort of contract or harder to relieve those costs if, for example, circumstances do change, like you said, in a recessionary environment, job losses, or even just changes in work as well. Because although the pandemic didn't quite move the working environment the way that it might have done, there's still loads of talk about the 4-day work week in the UK. And nobody's spoken about whether that would mean a 4-day work week salary either, because that's something that people need to acknowledge. If a company strips back to that number of days, yes, if your output's the same, they can maintain salaries, but there's no guarantee of that either. So I love the idea that there's maybe little things that can creep into your lifestyle, like you're out for coffee more, you're more comfortable going out for dinner more often. But of course, if you, like, for example, when I got my new job, it's just over a year anniversary since I moved, my salary increased, but I kept the car that I'd had for 2 years that I bought outright, and it basically runs on fresh air now. My road tax is really low, my insurance is really low.
Good for you.
All my payments. But the temptation was massively there to upgrade. But I kind of told myself that until I hit my kind of next financial milestone, that I'm happy with the car that I've got, and I don't do tremendous amounts of driving. And I think it links back to that values piece that we spoke about earlier, which I think is so vital people have awareness of it. I've got friends that have much better cars than me that I know financially aren't in the same position as me, but it's a high value for them. They're like, I want to drive this Mercedes or this BMW to this, with this spec on it, and it makes me happy. And I'm like, okay, brilliant. Well, I'm pretty calm as long as I've got a nice Volkswagen Golf. It's very standard, and as long as it gets me A to B and it's pretty safe and it's clean and it looks tidy and nobody's like, oh my god, I can't believe he's driving that, then I'm pretty comfortable, Katie.
I love it.
Whereas I think if I reassess my values, the house and the flat that I live in is far more important to me. So I'd much rather assign more capital towards that, because I spend more of my time here. I work from home regularly. I record my podcasts here. I'm very house proud as well. So I think when you look at where you spend your money, particularly in the big fixed ones, you don't need to pick one of the two, but you need to be aware of like what's going towards each. And even if my financial situation improves again, say I get another bonus this year, which is looking on track, fingers crossed with my performance, then I need to make sure that I'm understanding where I want to put that. Do I want to invest a little bit more? Do I want to spend it on a luxury or a liability?
Yeah. And it's funny because I think there's almost this feeling of like, on the car thing, I definitely had like a counting my chickens before they hatched moment in 2020, because, well, first of all, everything looked like it was going great. Like in January of 2020, it was like, oh, the airline's doing awesome. I'm up for promotion. I'm going to get a raise. And so I was like, I'm going to buy an Audi. So I buy this Audi in February of 2020. And then in March of 2020, they're like, oh, not only is no one getting promoted, but we're an airline and no one's flying. So actually pay cuts are coming. And it was such a valuable lesson for me, though, because it wasn't a car that was like way outside of my, it was still, to my credit, like I'm pretty risk averse. It was still within my means, but the fact that like I was doing those mental gymnastics in the dealership of like, well, it's okay if it's $400 a month because I'm about to get a raise and it'll probably just end up being like net neutral after I get the raise. And it's fine. I'm never going to make less money than I do now. And like, those assumptions were not necessarily wrong, and they were founded on good fact. Like, I wasn't being crazy, but the bottom line, and like what 2020 taught us, is just, you never know. Like, nothing is a guarantee. And so it's very dangerous, I think, to like make any type of financial decision that's going to like push you right up to the edge or be like right on the brink of like, okay or not okay.
Scenario as well. So like planning for the best case scenario is so risky, because you said I'm never going to invest in this, but coronavirus came along, the airlines weren't flying, and they went, well,
they said, hold my beer. Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. That's a really good way to put it. It's like, yeah, you're planning for the best case scenario. It's like, you can hope for the best, but you shouldn't plan for the best, because that means anything less than perfect is going to result in you having to like change course later.
One of the areas of lifestyle creep that I think you and I are both on the same page as is using the additional capital you've got to buy back more of your time to invest in other things that you care about. And chief among those for me has been a cleaner for the flat. And then my meals being meal prep for me. Now, the meal prep side of things is a sponsorship through my Instagram, because I've spent years taking my top off and talking about fitness, Katie. So it's coming home to roost. But however, my brother, he pays for his meals, and he pays for the cleaner with me. So we know that buying back our time with the improvements in our salary over the last couple of years has actually paid off dividends, because I spend that time either creating podcasts or researching podcast guests, playing golf. So it doesn't even have to be money generating activities like recording the podcast. It can be activities that maybe serve me well away from it, going for a walk when I've got an extra hour and a half a week that I used to spend to cleaning. So I'd love to hear a little bit around some of the areas that you've had lifestyle creep when it comes to buying back your time.
Yeah. Well, we're very similar in that respect, because cleaning and food are the two areas that I outsource as well. And there's like a bit of I feel like for me, there was a bit of like a gender thing coming into play, because I am married to a man, and yeah, go figure. But so I'm married, and he works at an office. So he's gone all day and I work from home. And so I guess I could peg it on the fact that I'm home all day and that he's not. But in some ways it felt like, oh, well, I'm the woman, so I'm going to have to be the one that cleans, and I'm going to have to be the one that cooks. And like, it kind of felt like I was getting stuck with a job I didn't sign up for. And so it became obvious to me that like my current at the time, before I decided to outsource these things, that my workload coupled with the amount of housework I was doing and like the food prep and just like taking care of our little family, it was really eating into like my ability to have any leisure time. Like, I felt like I was just constantly going, and frankly, it's a recipe for burnout. And the sad thing is that when it comes to keeping your place clean or making food, like, those are things that you kind of don't really have a choice. Like, I mean, you can live in filth, but that's not good for your mental health. So, you know, the laziness or like the burnout was starting to appear in my work. Like, I would not be putting as much effort in because I was just spread too thin. And so the first thing I outsourced was cleaning. So every 2 weeks I have people come, and it costs like $120 or $140 after tip. Well worth it. They clean for like 2 hours. The place is spotless. And then for the next 2 weeks, it's like by the end of the 2 weeks, it's starting to get a little dirty again. We have a big dog. And so they come, but anyway, it works really, really well. And it's like one thing on my mental checklist that I just get to be like, don't have to worry about that. It's taken care of. I'm not having to like use mental bandwidth for like, oh, when was the last time I vacuumed? Should I vacuum today? Well, maybe I should do the windows today. Like, I just love not having to even like think about those things.
And the unbelievable thing about it as well is people that clean for a living actually turn out to be better than you and I.
Yes.
When we turn our hand to it and kind of do it grudgingly sometimes, you're like, don't get me wrong, like before we had the cleaners, the flat was pretty much spotless because that's just kind of how we we live our lives. It's a bit American side.
Not surprised by that at all.
Yeah. But the cleaners, when they first came, actually, they joked. They were like, I can't believe you want us to come. We're like, well, to be fair, like we spend like maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours each a week doing this. So we're buying back a lot of time between us. And yeah, they do a better job than I would do if I was doing it.
Totally. So especially because there are like parts of cleaning that I just resent. I'm like, I don't want to clean toilets or the shower, especially the shower. That feels like an event to like get in the shower with like a bathing suit on and like scrub with the water. I'm like, no, thank you. So there's that, but then there's also the food, and we do spend a lot of money on food. We hired a local business female-owned business. It's like a chef service. So you pick your meals every week off of a menu. Everything is priced very consistently. So it's like every entree is 4 servings and it's $41. Every side is like 2 or 3 servings and it's, $11 or $12. And then there's like breakfast items and whatnot. So we will spend around $1,000 a month on that service, but it means that like we're not grocery shopping, we're not meal planning, we're not spending time every afternoon or evening cooking. And the thing is, like, I understand people that love to cook. I totally get it. I think if I wasn't working, I think I would be more amenable to the idea of like cooking as like a fun thing to do, like a hobby but like when it's every single night and you've just worked for 10 hours, it does not feel like a fun hobby to me. It feels like another thing on my to-do list that requires mental bandwidth and time. And so it's been amazing to have this service available to us where we can pay a premium to buy back that time, to buy back that mental energy. And then when my husband comes home from work, it's like, all right, which meal do we want tonight? Put it in the microwave. You've got this like beautifully crafted food that's better than what we would be making and more creative than what we would be making. And it's ready in 3 minutes and we can hang out together and eat and watch TV and there's no cleanup. Like it just works really well for our lifestyle right now. And I mean, I do look forward to the day that like cooking is fun and it's like something that I enjoy, but right now is not that time.
Yeah, and if you have more time for it, maybe you'll enjoy it more.
I think so too.
In the future, once you're more free. We've talked lots about like money management and saving there, but I'd love to go a little bit more into investing. And one of the big things that I've seen you write about before is one of the kind of common beginner or intermediate investment strategies is picking a large cap fund like the S&P 500, or in the UK, it's the UK FTSE 250. What are the pros and cons here?
Yeah, so I think the pro with just going with a large cap fund is that historically over time, they have gotten good returns. So I think it'd be safe to say that if you were 100% in either of the 2 large cap funds that you just mentioned, that over any 40 or 50 year timeline, it's pretty airtight, safe bet that you're going to end up with a substantial amount more capital than you started with. I think the downside, though, and the risk to going all in on large cap is that you're very overexposed to like one type of company. And typically those types of companies are ones that are typically overvalued, like overpriced for the most part, not always, but that they tend to be overpriced. So you're going to pay more for your returns. They tend to be very susceptible to like the interest rate environment because these are companies that are usually borrowing large amounts of cheap capital. So like if interest rates are going up and capital is harder to come by. So I think that that's certainly part of it. And then I would say the more behavioral side of things is just that if you're very, very hyper exposed to just like one segment of the economy, you're going to feel those ups and downs really, really dramatically. And I think we can point to periods in history where you had years at a time where you would have lost money just being invested in the S&P 500. Like 2000 to 2009 is the most popular example, but it's true. If you would have invested money in 2000, like in 2009, you had less money. So it's like kind of goes against that sense of like, oh, well, markets always go up, stocks always go up.
It's a recency bias, isn't it? Because we had that much between 2010 to kind of 2021 up until the start of this year. The S&P 500 has been a phenomenal investment for you to be exposed to. But there was that lost decade that you and I are too young to have experienced, really. I started investing in 2017, so I had no exposure to that whatsoever. Right. So my recency bias says the S&P 500, yeah, I'm in there.
Yeah, sure thing, right? So I think, and like over the long term, I do think it's a sure thing. Like I want to make that very clear. Over like extended long, like many decades, like yes, I do think it's safe to call that a sure thing because capitalism works. Like that's the bottom line. Companies that are not profitable are going to die and companies that are profitable will replace them. So, you've got that, but I think it's harder to weather the storms and not panic and sell if you're not diversified. Whereas like there were other indices during 2000 to 2009, like emerging markets that did very well. So like you would have made money if you were diversified in that way. So I think in 2022, like my sense is just that we have so much technology available to us now, whether it's a Betterment or a Wealthfront or a Vanguard robo-advisor. They even have a robo-advisor option now where you have an algorithm that has a philosophy baked in that is going to diversify you across different indices in proportions that it deems responsible and appropriate for your age and risk tolerance. To me, it's almost like, if you're just trying to save money in fees by just buying the S&P 500 ETF and like calling it a day, you're going to pay for that in returns later. If the S&P 500 has another down decade where you could have just paid 25 basis points to Betterment or Vanguard or Wealthfront to like have that exposure across the board. And I mean, historically speaking, the US has been the dominant world economy for the last 100 years, but there's also reason to believe that that could be changing. And so like being 100% exposed to US domestic equities might not be like what's the best thing in the future. Like we just don't know. It could be that the US economy remains on top, or it could be that we're on the way out. There's just no way to know for sure. And I think there's compelling data that points to both being possible and being true. So I think like in the past, international exposure has underperformed US exposure, but like that classic disclaimer, past performance is not indicative of future returns. Like I would personally rather own everything and just, even if that means I'm going to have lower returns than someone that just gets lucky and concentrates in the right thing. Like I do not have the confidence in my ability to predict the future to just go all in on one country or one index.
Yeah, 100%. And making sure that, you can maybe have most of your exposure within a big, large cap index fund like the S&P or whatever you choose. But being exposed to some of the smaller caps, while that wouldn't have been massively profitable for the last 10 years, it may well be worth the exposure for the next few because it might balance out your portfolio if we do indeed have this fabled lost decade, which people tend to be worrying about as well.
Yeah. And I think it's scary. I mean, like, I won't lie. It definitely isn't fun right now to hear people saying like, oh, returns are going to be negative or flat for the next 10 years. It's like, but if they are, like, we're young. Like, of all the people that should feel okay about it, it's those that are still in their wealth accumulation phase, because we are going to be buying in at prices that are lower than if it had just kept going up. So I know we can weather the storm. And I know that, to your point, like diversifying into things like small cap value can really help. And historically, it has really helped. I think like 100-year annualized average return of S&P is like 10%. And then the same figure for small cap value is like 13 or 14%. So it's not like a small margin that small cap value has outperformed large cap over time when averaged. But at the end of the day, I tend to fall back on this sense of like, well, I'm going to try to control what I can control. I cannot control the US economy. I cannot control what the returns are that I'm going to get in my portfolio, but I can control the amount I'm spending and I can control my income. And those two things, I think, are going to, if you can get a grip on those two things, like, you're going to be well positioned to weather even a decade-long bear market.
Yeah, it's a winning mindset, because I've got friends that are also quite into crypto, and that makes up maybe like just under a third of my portfolio in terms of what I invest, and it's a bloodbath at the moment. You don't. Like, if I realized my different coins that I hold at the moment, I would be a loss. It would not be good. But I'm very calm over the longer term because I don't need immediate access to that percentage of my lifestyle funds, and I don't need it to sustain how I live. It's just there for the future. And if anything, if I can accumulate a little bit more, Bitcoin's on sale just now, so I can crack it.
That's the way you got to think about it, really. I mean, like, I was looking yesterday, and I think yesterday or 2 days ago, our household net worth is officially down over $100,000. And I expected to be more panicky about that, but like in a weird way, like they are just kind of numbers on a screen to me. And I think the reason I feel that way is precisely the reason you just said, which is I don't need this right now to support my lifestyle. Like, this has no bearing on how I live my day-to-day life. This is for the future. This is me hedging for 20 years from now. And I saw this awesome quote from somebody on Twitter that was like, I'm not worried about stock prices in 2023. I'm worried about stock prices in 2050. It's like, do I think prices in 2050 are going to be higher than they are now? Like almost undoubtedly, unless you have like a Japan situation. But I don't think we have reason to believe that that's where we're headed. And like I said, you never know. So we diversify, but I wouldn't feel like I'm not feeling all that fearful right now. I think the writing was kind of on the wall that this was coming, frankly.
Yeah, one of the other big factors in the storm that we're weathering just now is the I word, which is inflation. Rates are higher than previous levels, and the percentages that are banded around, to me, from my experience in terms of what I'm experiencing in terms of my purchasing power in my personal life, but also my work life, I'm noticing that they're probably higher than some of the figures. In the UK,
I agree.
In the UK, we said 7%, and I think the US was something like 8.5. I think they said for the most.
Yeah, I think the last, because it's a rolling like 12-month average. So I think the most recent figure was like 9 something in the US. So it's certainly high.
I know you've looked into the psychology of inflation.
Yeah.
I read one of your blogs on it. What are your thoughts on that at the moment? Like, how's your head when it comes to inflation?
Yeah. So one thing that I first of all, I agree. I think that like when you look at the independent like sectors and how much like something is random as like chicken or gas or, you know, these independent segments of the economy, like how much prices have gone up, it in many cases dwarfs the CPI. So that's a little bit strange, honestly. But in any case, I think there are a few things worth noting about inflation. And the first is like, I think you can help to temper your own experience of it through substitution. So I think you and I have talked about this before, but like, you know, if you typically buy steak at the grocery store and steak costs 30% more, it's like maybe you're going to buy chicken now. And I think you see that at a macro level, like people's preferences change. There's even this like joke now in the US that like people should buy electric cars because gas is so expensive. And like, I've never actually looked at like the plot line of like sales of the Ford F-150 against gas prices, but anecdotally, I have heard that like people buy smaller cars when gas prices are high. So I think there's that level of control that you can exert over the situation. But at the same time, it is problematic specifically for one subsegment of the population, and that is people who don't own assets, because the inflation is across the board. We saw the inflation in the prices of stocks and homes and assets. We are also seeing it in consumer goods. And so if you're just living, you know, paycheck to paycheck on an hourly wage and you own no assets that have appreciated with the inflation, then like you're going to really be feeling it. And there's really no good short-term solution for that in my mind. The only thing that I think of that kind of like makes me feel better is, well, if we know that assets go up in value, and they're not always, like there are certainly historical like times where this has not been the case, but generally speaking, like price inflation and asset inflation are linked because it's usually it's like the consequence of having excess liquidity in the system. And if you think about it, the corporations that are generating higher profits through increased prices, like that's going to be reflected in their share prices too. So like theoretically, if the corporations are making more money, then like the stock prices should be going up, or like eventually you should see that like return to real value. And so I always just use it as like fuel for myself to like just keep buying stocks. Whether or not that's just like me putting a band-aid on the issue is probably another story, but
it's taking positive action. It's taking positive action in an environment that has some factors that allow you, based on your earning power and your mindset, to take those actions. And you spoke about increased liquidity in the market and the driving up of stocks. And some people would say that the drop in the S&P 500 and stock price that we've seen is largely due to the fact that some of the money, or a lot of it, that was going in during the last couple of years from things like stimulus checks and the furlough scheme that we had in the UK was almost money that was generated without labor. And by that, I mean, I know in the US, was it maybe like 1,400 that you guys were sent to?
Several times.
Yeah. And I think you and I have talked again this before when we were getting organized, that the money in the UK that was given to people who were out of work, so, or their role was not deemed essential for a period. So they were put on what was called the furlough scheme, and they were given either 80% of their salary, and that was topped up by their employer, or they were given 100% total. Whereas you were still working during it, and there were stimulus checks sent in.
Still coming.
And so much of those stimulus checks went into the market, went into crypto. Look at what happened with Reddit. People went crazy in terms of like, what am I going to do with this? Not what am I going to do with this money? Because obviously they need the money to eat and live. But that money was invested into the market, and it maybe caused some sort of slightly artificial bump at times, in my view.
Agreed. No, I completely agree. And by the way, I think the way that like the EU countries handled it, where they basically said, you know, there was a couple different instances that I heard or different experience where it was like what you just said, where it's, oh, we're going to replace your salary if you're deemed non-essential. Others gave like the corporations the money and said, just don't fire anybody. Like just keep paying the wages and we'll give you the money that you need to pay the wages. In the US, it was really indiscriminate. Like they just kind of mailed the checks to everybody, regardless of that person's employment situation, and unemployment income went way up. It like doubled. So I had friends that were making more on unemployment than they made when they were employed, which is crazy. But to your point, like that little fundamental piece of like the money came out of thin air, like it was not backed by real value or labor or like innovation or creativity in the economy. It was like credit that was printed out of nowhere. So yes, like I think that's kind of why I feel like, well, we knew this was going to happen. Like, surely, like the people working at the Federal Reserve or like in charge of these decisions didn't think that this was not going to happen. And I think that you can even look at like the decisions that were made in 2020. I think it was one of those things where people were so terrified that things were going to absolutely collapse and fall apart if we did nothing. So they were like, even if we do suffer some consequences later, it's going to be worth propping up the economy now so that we don't have experienced something worse than the Great Depression. Whereas in like 2021, that was a little bit of a different story to me, because that's the point at which it's like, all right, now it feels like overkill. Like now it feels like we're doing more than we need to. We're overreacting, overcorrecting. And I think that's my hypothesis, is that that's more so what we're paying for right now is like the money that was kind of the 2021 decision.
There was going to be huge pain, and it was going to be pretty traumatic. And that combined with potentially loved ones dying or people falling ill or just the general hysteria around the virus, which at the start, I think back to some of the measures that were in place that now seem a little bit, well, not a little bit, very extreme in terms of how the actual virus transpired. And there's lots of different factors for that. We won't go down the COVID rabbit hole, but it's clear that the response to it over the longer term was quite extreme, meaning that there was a lot of capital created through quantitative easing that now we're kind of paying for. So that huge dunt of pain that we were likely to get has almost been drawn out over the period and is sort of hitting us now with the cost of living crisis that we're in. And it's hard for people to take that on board and realize that the fact that maybe if you weren't working and you were spending money as you would normally on your rent, your car, as soon as the holidays and stuff were able again, you were spending money on that. Now, of course, that stimulates the economy. But if you weren't not saving for a rainy day, but if you weren't putting away money to realize that this cost of living crisis and some of the prices that we're experiencing now were going to come, it's more painful now than it might have been in that short dunt. It's now going to be maybe a more
drawn out. It's a good way to put it. It's almost like the pain that was created was going to be felt one way or the other. We just kind of transferred it to a different type of pain.
I think it had to be, Katie. It's not a nice message to give, but it's maybe quite a rational one. One of the final areas, if your diary allows, Katie, I'd love to ask you about was in regards to some of the research you cited from, is it Nick Maggiulli? Is that how I pronounce his name?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's an absolute savage. I loved hearing him on your podcast.
He really is.
Yeah. You cited his work on of dollars and data, and it was really clear that it sounds really obvious, but the more income you earn, the more you save. And it's frightening how obvious that sounds when I say it. But when you dived into it with Nick and I went onto his blog, it makes total sense. And it really is something that a lot of people forget about. Maybe they want to be more frugal. Maybe they want to find the next killer stock to pick, or they want to take some of they want to do a large market cap, but they want to have some small exposure like we've talked about. But ultimately, one of the biggest drivers is, can you earn more money from your day job or your business?
Yep. Yeah. So I loved that work from him, because I think so often there is a lot of judgment and shame in the personal finance world. And often it's levied at people that, I don't want to say like don't have a choice, but kind of like if you are working a minimum wage job and you're working really crazy hours to try to make ends meet. It's like the problem is not that you're not working enough, and the problem is not that you're overspending. Like, even when you look at the I forget the data source that he had, but basically like the averages that people in the lowest 20% of earners in the US are spending every month. It's like they're basically paying for the roof over their head, a car to get themselves to work, and healthcare and like food. And that was it. It's like there's practically like no room to cut in those budgets. And so he basically looks at save rates and the correlation to income. And like, wouldn't you know it, they're correlated almost perfectly. So it's like the people that are in the top 20% of earners save half of their income. Well, that's because it's way easier to save half your income when you make $250,000 a year than when you make $25,000 a year. And so it sounds kind of callous, but the more that I've kind of like, when I first got into this stuff, I was very focused on cutting expenses. I was like very much beating the drum of like discipline and sacrifice. And I think as I've gone on and I'm a few years into it now and have experienced more life of my own, like it's almost like, oh, actually, no, just earning a lot of money is the cheat code. Like if you're going to expend a ton of energy on anything, don't make it day trading. Don't make it trying to, hunt down all your subscriptions. Make it earning more. That is like the one thing that kind of makes you, I don't want to say infallible, but like that's a pretty powerful moat to have around you. If you can increase your income, pretty much everything else will fall into place.
Yeah. How can I generate more value from the work that I do for my company that I work for or for the business that I own?
Yep.
Because ultimately that's going to be a much easier way to buy financial freedom, because the kind of kicker within that as well, and I think the figure was like 174,000 after tax income. They're saving 50% of that. 50% of that is a lot of money to save every year.
Yeah.
And of course that's going to compound harder and be much larger over the period. So if you can start to increase what you get in your day job or what you get from your side hustle or what you get from your full-time business, if you're saving more of that, it's the double header, isn't it? Not only are you able to save more, you're actually saving more and investing more.
Yes. Well, it's the law of large numbers too. Like even if you can sit there, I love this guy named Jack Rains. He's great. He writes a blog called Young Money, and he has a blog post he came out with called what is it? It's like the true definition of alpha. And he's like, even if you can get a 500% return on a stock, if it took you 50 hours of research to figure out that was the stock you had to pick, like your 500% return on $1,000 is still probably less money than you could have made devoting 50 hours to like building a business or like getting a raise or, earning a higher commission check. Like, I think we just kind of lose the forest through the trees sometimes and forget that a huge percentage return on not a lot of money is not a lot of money. So it's like direct your effort accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely, Katie. I've been such a huge fan of James Clear's work with Atomic Habits from 2018. And for somebody like yourself who is really deep in this area, what are some of your keystone habits that you would share with the listeners?
It's a good question. Mine are probably pretty boring. I try to...
Boring but effective?
Boring but effective. Yeah, let's say that. I like
I'll
that
rebrand them for you, Katie.
Yeah, thank you. Actively, you're rebranding in the moment. So there are a few things I think that I notice, I feel it when I don't do it. And that is exercising in the morning and sitting down. And I don't necessarily always call it meditating, but like sitting for 10 minutes with my eyes closed and just like trying to focus on breathing and like getting really quiet. And journaling. So like very obvious keystone habits. I mean, workout, meditate, journal, like those are like, hello, duh. That's like steps A, B, and C in any like self-help book you're going to read. But for me, it really helps set my day off on the right course. And because I do really love what I do, sometimes it actually takes like a lot of discipline to like actually do those things. Cause sometimes I wake up and I'm like, I have an idea and I just want to go. I just want to come upstairs and start working. So I think those habits have been very impactful for me. And then the other habit that I would credit with a lot of like productivity gains that I've managed would be, there was a while ago where I sat down and I wrote a list of everything that I felt like would move the business forward. So it's like, reaching out to podcasters like yourself to have these types of conversations or, asking for feedback periodically from mentors or, spending an hour at a time, like really listening and reading and like learning something new. Everything that I felt like these are the things that if I were able to do these things consistently, it would drive the business forward. And then I took that list and I mapped them onto a blank week and said, all right, well, on Monday mornings then from 8 to 9, that's going to be the time that I do this. And Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm going to respond to emails from 11 to 11:30. And so I try to put these like focus blocks on the calendar where not only do I have the like list of things, but I actually have them on a calendar where something will pop up and be like, time to reach out to podcast. It's like, okay, well, I guess I'm doing that then.
Have you read Nariel Indistractable?
No, wait, but I have that on a list somewhere of books that I want to read.
I've had him on the podcast, and it was one of the most helpful books for me. And his system is called time blocking. It's exactly what you've done there.
Oh,
it's
wow.
Like,
oh my God.
What are the things that are my intentions and the things that I told myself I was going to do? Now put them in a time and make them almost non-negotiable.
Yes.
And then have like boundaries around it. So for example, you and I both enjoy creating our podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Reaching out to podcast guests within a set hour that we do every week, great, do it within that hour, but don't let it spill into other elements of the day because emails are like, they're so insidious. Yeah, they're very low value returns. And inbox zero, yeah, it's great to have it, but is it actually got a high return? Whereas if you put in, for example, another hour where it's working on one of your blogs, it's slightly harder to sit down and get into the mode to write a blog for an hour than it is to ping off another email to a guest. You're like, oh, wow, they'd be great on my podcast. That's quite a low level. It's an important task, but it's very easy to do. And you don't need to get into like a flow or you don't need to be disciplined to do it. It's kind of like, just do it. So I like the fact that somebody like yourself with so much going on is taking time to be like, these are the things that move me and my business forward. And they're going in these hours and they happen.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, no, I'll have to, that reminds me that I wanted to get that book. I'll download that today. Yeah, because I think the email thing, that's a perfect example. Cause like there are certain like productive things that feel good. And like inbox zero is one of those things where it feels like you've checked something off the list. But to your point, it's not really additive. Like you're really just responding. And like, yes, it's important to be responsive. So like, I do try to block time every other day to make sure I'm answering people so no one's waiting like weeks to hear from me. But I will find that like if I'm ever doing something like writing a blog post or writing a podcast episode and I feel stuck or I'm like, oh man, this is like a tough problem that I'm trying to solve, I always naturally just like gravitate to email as like, save me.
You're gonna
like,
love this book because
really? Oh, good.
A lot of our distraction, this isn't a spoiler, you probably know this anyway, a lot of our need for distraction, like doing busybody work, comes from discomfort.
Yes.
So the discomfort of my words aren't coming easily to me. What can I do to still make Katie feel like I'm moving forward? I'll go answer that email because I know it needs to be done at some point. I'll do it now. But actually, if you surf that urge and sit with the moment and then go back and go through it. And
surf the urge. I like that. The urge,
yeah. It's not that I'm in any way versed to give advice on eating disorders, but that's a big piece of advice that's given around people who have like challenges with like cravings and like uncontrollable urges to like binge on food. They have to sit with the urge and try and like feel, why is this happening? It's the same when we run away from the harder tasks within our workday.
Yeah.
Or a harder task within our creation stuff that you do. So incredible. And it doesn't surprise me that you've got some really strong habits, Katie. But the last question to ask you is, where should people head towards if they want to continue the conversation with you?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. So if you're into podcasting, which I'll assume you are if you've already listened all the way to this part of the conversation, the Money with Katie show is available wherever you get your podcasts. We have really enlightening conversations, much like this one that Colin so graciously facilitated, where we talk about all things money, values, financial psychology, you name it. And then on Instagram and Twitter, I'm just at Money with Katie, and then moneywithkatie.com is the blog. So pretty much if you Google Money with Katie, you're going to find all of these things. It just is a matter of like the way you like to learn. So thank you, Colin, for having me.
No, a pleasure, Katie. I'll link Instagram and your website in the show notes below. Wherever you listen to this, you can go and find the Money with Katie podcast as well, and you won't regret it at all. Thank you so much again for joining us, guys. And I'll be back to speak to you all again very